Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another podcast, this time not in a car, but through the medium of the internet due to lockdown. I'm Gareth, and this is the Sherlock Holmes to my Mycroft Holmes, Sarah.
Hello.
And as we're thinking about Sherlock Holmes this time, I think it was a couple of weeks ago now, we watched two different versions of Holmes. One was A Scandal in Bohemia, and we watched the Jeremy Brett version. Then we also watched the Benedict Cumberbatch A Scandal in Belgravia.
And both also read the original book, Scandal in Bohemia, as well by Arthur Conan Doyle.
Yes. So I think we're going to just think about questions and then probably go wildly off on tangents, because that's the kind of thing we do anyway. So which version did you like best and why?
Okay, so for me, the version I like the best, and you're going to disagree with this, is the BBC version. And the reason I liked that one the best is because I thought every single character, including characters that were only just introduced and characters that hadn't met before, were actually very, very well established. So the characters, their personalities were very well established, and the relationships were very, very well established as well, even if the characters hadn't met. And I think that was probably through like clever writing, because, for example, I don't think Mrs. Hudson and Molly had met up to them, but through the script writing, it gave the impression that they had met before, when at the Christmas party, Molly's discussing Mrs. Hudson's hit with her and so on, which suggests that they've had meetings before. So all the characters are pulled very well together, which I think makes for a richer story than just the mystery, because most of us know the story and the mystery and how it all gets resolved, so it adds another dynamic to the story and keeps it relevant and interesting, I think.
I think
what was your favourite version?
Well, I was just going to say, I do actually, that's one thing I do appreciate about the BBC version. I mean, we were talking about this like just after watching them, and I was struggling to think of things that I did really like about it. But the one thing I did like is that it did go more into character. There were more character moments to the BBC version. The Granada version, the Jeremy Brett version, was a lot more, is just kind of just the story, just following along with the mystery. And so there's not as much room for character moments. So I think that's one thing that I did like about the BBC version. I did prefer the Jeremy Brett version. To be honest, I wonder how much of that is just simply the first one you saw. Like, I don't know which was BBC the first Holmes one you saw?
BBC was the first introduction to Sherlock. So whenever I think, like when I was reading the book and they were talking about calling cabs and stuff, I was imagining taxi cabs in my brain, which is obviously rubbish because it's
the black cab,
and it would have been a horse and carriage. So that's kind of the version that I've got. That was the first version I've ever watched. Because so it probably does have something to do with that.
Yeah, because for me, the Jeremy Brett one was the first one I saw. I prefer it, I think, because to an extent I am a bit of a kind of stickler for old things and staying the way they are. So I think I do prefer it because it's closer to the original. I think if we do more comparisons in future, I think I will probably, in general, end up leaning towards the older, more or the original thing. I think part of the reason I think I preferred it is because A Scandal in Bohemia, and I might be wrong on it, but there's not going to be that many that are like this, is in the Arthur Conan Doyle story and the Jeremy Brett version, which is very close to it. It's the only one, I think, where Holmes loses. Because in that version, he's trying to get the photograph, but he doesn't get it. Irene Adler, not Irene Adler in the original version, took the, or in the Brett version, takes the photograph with her, and he doesn't get it. Whereas in the BBC version, it's a success. He manages it. I think. Go on.
Oh, I was going to say, I think a lot of people have picked up a lot of that, and it actually gets a lot of criticism. The fact that Sherlock wins and Irena doesn't manage to beat Sherlock at that point. So I think you're not the only one who feels like that, because I really like how he's not actually bothered that he's beaten her either. He just that she's beaten him. He's just kind of, he actually admires her for it. I think that adds a really nice element to his character.
That is one thing that I like, that is kind of a good kind of not copy, but follow on in both of them. Whereas Sherlock, this is really frustrating because they're the same, because they've got the same name. But Cumberbatch, in his version, he's summoned to Buckingham Palace, and he just doesn't care. You know, he's just going to go as he is, which is in a sheet. And then similarly, you've got Brett. He meets at the beginning and at the end, he meets the King of Bohemia, and both times the king's like expecting him to bow at that point.
Yeah.
And he's just like, okay, well, yeah, okay, well, I don't like, I've got all the information now. You can just leave at the beginning, and he just doesn't. He just goes back. Holmes goes to his desk, and then at the end, he just kind of walks off, taking the photograph that Irena Adler leaves behind. But having said that, while I think I like that bit, there are a few points where the BBC version kind of tries to take elements that didn't fit, like showing up to Irene Adler, her house, place of work, whatever, in a dog collar to pretend to be a vicar. And it's, I don't think it's particularly convincing. I was like, it was quite see-through.
I agree with you. I was saying that they probably had to do it that way because unlike with the other two versions we watched, Irene Adler does actually have feelings back for Sherlock.
Yeah, that's another difference between.
I think probably if he had dressed in a better disguise, that probably wouldn't have come across as much, because we need to see that Irene is attracted to him. So I think that's probably why. But I do agree, his disguises is just awful, and they are much better in the other two versions.
Yeah, like I think if he didn't have the dog collar on, I think it would have just been exactly the same. I mean, just putting on dog collar like that would make Clark Kent and Superman go, oh, that's a bit of a see-through disguise, that is. So, I mean, I think I also didn't like the plain plot coming into it in the modern version. It seemed like, and I'm saying this, and I think the only other one I've actually seen of the Benedict Cumberbatch version is A Study in Pink, and I really liked that. It was closer to the original than this was, but that's I think technically is a novella, not a short story in the original when it was written. So they had more material to work with to go into the hour and a half. So I wonder if they felt, we can't just fit in this little bit of the this story. We need to pad it out to get to the hour and a half.
Well, they were trying to connect her to Moriarty, and this is actually something that, because the Irene Adler in the BBC version, it really divides audiences, and this is something that she was criticised for, the fact that in more modern versions, Irene Adler has been portrayed as working with the criminals. So in this case, she's working with Moriarty, and actually in the Robert Downey Jr. version, which you haven't seen yet,
I've not seen, no.
She's also working with Moriarty there as well. Whereas obviously in the Jeremy
Brett.
What's his name?
Jeremy Brett.
Jeremy Brett version, and in the original story, she's working for herself. She's doing all that independently. So they feel that takes, some people feel that takes an element away from her character, the fact that she's working for someone else rather than doing things independently and from herself. They actually think it's actually, for a modern version, they actually think it's actually less feminist in a way.
I mean, yeah, I was thinking that is like, especially with Holmes losing to her, it was very like, I think it's not only is that one of the, if not the only one, it's one of the very few times he loses. But he also is losing to a kind of woman who's playing very much against gender roles. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that in a way the 1890s story and the 1980s TV version is in some ways slightly more progressive than the 2010s version
Yeah,
in
I've
that
been
sense.
thinking about this, and I haven't made my mind up yet, but I do know what you mean. Yeah, in a way, it is more progressive because she is doing all of yeah. What did you just say? Because she's doing all this for herself
Well,
rather than
well,
working
well.
for
I mean,
someone else.
that was kind of well, that was in my head.
Said.
I didn't say it, but that was in my head.
Okay.
Is she beats him? She beats Holmes. She's one of the
Yeah.
few people to do it as a woman, and she's playing against gender roles because she's this. She's an adventuress. She's doing all these things. In fact, in the Jeremy Brett version, you see her talking to the king, and she's dressed in the kind of like top and tails that you kind of expect. That you might expect more of a man to wear rather than like a full like ball gown type thing. But it kind of as kind of you just kind of mentioned then and were alluding to before. In other versions, she's working normally for certainly in this version, and I think we were talking before Robert Downey Jr. version. She's working for Moriarty, so she's working for someone else who is a man. Which I know that shouldn't really come into it, but it's weird like how Arthur Conan Doyle was actually, if you read some of the other stories, and we were talking about books you've read, but you've not read one I'm thinking of, which is I think The Adventure of the Yellow Face. That's quite progressive as well in some ways. Some people have complained about it, but if you actually read it, and certainly the ending has progressive elements to it. And I can't remember what we were talking about.
I think you were talking about, I think you mentioned briefly something about giving her dressing in tails. And it's done differently in the BBC version. This happens a lot, I feel like, as they're trying to get women more involved in film. They tend to give women traditionally more male traits. So in Irene Adler's case, she uses, and this happens in the Jeremy Brett version actually, because obviously I'm jumping here. Obviously, in the Jeremy Brett version, that was done in the 80s. Is that right?
Yes.
So it was done in the 80s. So the masculine trait that Arthur Conan Doyle gives her, and it's mentioned that she's I've forgotten the exact quote, but she's got the intellect of a man. So her intellect is attributed as a male trait, isn't it? In the book. Whereas her beauty is attributed as a female trait. I cannot remember the exact quote, which is a shame. I think I've probably got it written here. I'll quickly find it. Where is it? Oh, yeah, she has the face of the most beautiful of women and the mind of the most resolute of men. So her beauty is a female trait, and her mind is a male trait. And then they sort of play on this by getting her to cross-dress is a male at one point. Whereas in the 80s, obviously women's fashion had changed. So, getting her to dress as a man in an 80s TV show is kind of, it's just normal, really, because women were wearing trousers at that point. And then in the BBC version, they get her to be able to, in fact, in the Jeremy Brett version as well, what they do instead is they give her a gun. So, do you remember at the beginning?
At the beginning, yeah. So she's the kind of armed one, kind of scaring off the people who've come to try and find the picture.
Yeah, so they've given her a masculine trait, and again they give her a masculine trait in the BBC version because she's able to physically fight people and she's able to use guns and stuff. So that's kind of a fun way that she's evolved. That it's actually like that, which kind of makes it less progressive in a way because it's attributing all of her good traits. All the traits that Holmes admires in her, and they're saying that those are her masculine traits. So, actually, that makes it slightly less progressive. If you think about it in that sense.
I mean, well, I'm mainly thinking in the sense that she beats him. She beats him. Like she's the like. I think she is the only one who does stop him from achieving what he's trying to set out to do. And it's like out of all of them, it's one of the very few times he faces a woman. I don't know if there's a woman as a antagonist in any of the other stories. I'm trying to rack my brains. I can't think of one. There probably is though. But yeah. So I mean, that's kind of my thought on the progressive side of it. That's why I say progressive. So yeah, I think partly for me, the BBC version is like with the vicar. Is it like with Holmes putting on the dog collar and pretending to be the vicar? Is in some ways it's trying to veer close to the original, but without being too close. And for me, it's kind of that halfway position just doesn't quite work. It's too different. It's too different for me to be able to not think of the original.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, and also it's too similar for me to be able to say, okay, this is just, they've just got similar names and it's a different thing. It straddles the line and I don't think it works for me.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I'm sure for other people, it's one of the things that got them into Sherlock Holmes.
Yes, it's what got me into Sherlock Holmes.
So it's that kind of weird kind of, it doesn't work for me, but I'm sure, but I mean, it clearly does work for someone else, that kind of in between picking on it. So I mean, we were just talking about, I say just a few minutes ago, talking about that we liked the characterization in the first, not in the first version, the BBC version. So yeah, in the BBC version, who's your favourite character?
Oh God, mine is I love John Watson. He is such a good character. And I love how he's kind of progressed as well, because like in the BBC version, he's kind of morally dubious in a way, because he's got this real sort of a huge character trait, which is emphasized in the first ever episode, is that he's got this real sort of obsession with the macabre and with danger and with risk, because he comes back from the war, and he's got this tremor, he's got this problem with his leg that's all psychological, and Mycroft points out to him that when he's under threat, he stops trembling. And he says to him, it's not that you're haunted by the war, it's that you missed the war. So I quite like that side to him. It kind of darkens his character a little bit, because whereas in the other versions, not completely, but he's kind of presented as this very morally upstanding sort of citizen, really.
Well, I think it's partially the times. So it's a Victorian time when it was written, and so the Jeremy Brett tries to be closer to that. And so part of that is, if you're a Victorian gentleman, you abide by the social societal rules.
He doesn't completely though, because this is why I said, he's not morally dubious in the other version, but he does have his own sense of morality, because there's that part in the book and there's that part in the Jeremy Brett version when Sherlock's asking him if he doesn't mind breaking the law, and he says, yeah, that's fine, not if it's in a good cause. So that suggests to me that goes against what you're saying.
Well, I think it's why I said societal rules and not laws. Is it goes? Okay. It's kind of almost a sense of honor, I think, attached to him. Whereas I think obviously nowadays the ideas of honor and chivalry are trying to think of the right word. I think are not as encouraged and not as kind of. I don't want to say they're not accepted, but they're not seen as being as important as they were in Victorian times. And I'm getting the feeling you're about to disagree. But
no, I'm listening.
So I think that's kind of why there's that difference. Is it is a different audience, and also kind of set different times and different settings. I would agree with you. I think of this version, I think Watson's probably my favourite.
He's brilliant.
Of the characters. I think, yeah.
And it's not just because he's morally dubious as well, but it's the fact that in the other versions, he's kind of he's like, sometimes he's used as not so much in the Jeremy Brett version, but sometimes in other versions he's used as sort of a comic edition.
Yeah, the Basil Rathbone kind of is kind of what's his name? I can't remember. I think Norman someone. I think he was very much kind of comic relief to kind of lighten the tone.
Yeah. And I
and
feel
to
like
be
it was
kind
the
of like,
same in Private Life of Sherlock Holmes as well. I feel like he was used. You've not seen that, but
I've
it
not seen that
was
one.
used there for comic relief as well. Sorry, I think I interrupted you. What else were you going to say?
I think it was just more talking about the comic. I think it was also to make it more obvious that Holmes was talking down to him and having to explain everything in kind of a lot of detail, which you can do anyway. It happens in the Brett one and in the Cumberbatch version. Despite having a relatively intelligent Watson, they kind of Holmes still has to explain the reasoning. It did actually have one of my least favorite scenes in this, which from a character perspective, was at the party with Molly.
Right.
Where Holmes is just very quickly making deductions. So like, oh, right, oh, yeah, you've got a boyfriend. You're going to something else and you're going to see this boyfriend. And you can tell because you've dressed up really nicely in this and this and this. And it's at the point where the audience is going, Holmes, you're an idiot. This is for you. You're the person she's dressed up nicely for.
Yeah.
The audience shouldn't really be quicker on the uptake than Holmes. I know, even though this is a kind of more social thing.
I don't agree. I think it's good that they show that. I mean, it was horrible what he did to her,
I think that might be why I don't like it, because I don't like awkwardness in films, because quite frankly I do that enough anyway. But being socially awkward, so like, let's just
how well done that scene was then, because there was that awkwardness and you can see everyone looking like, oh my god, Sherlock, it's for you, you idiot. But it adds that different dynamic to his character, like, you know, he's really intellectual and he's really clever and he's great at deductions, but he's actually also just completely emotionally stunted, and he doesn't really care about, oh no, that's wrong. He's just a bit brusque at times, and it makes him less perfect in a way. I don't think he was ever perfect, but even more obviously so.
I think that's why I don't like that one. But I think it's also a sense that in the Brett version, and I think this was in the Dancing Men, which we also watched, but we're not really going to touch on too much. I think he mentions it, that he doesn't like theorizing without all of the facts, all of the evidence. So you'd think he wouldn't just keep going and deducing things and not get to the end without knowing the end point. Having said that, I did like it in A Study in Pink at the end, where he does exactly the same thing, and as he's deducing the man who shot the cab driver, and he's like, oh, this is the kind of person he's going to be, like the kind of psychological profile. He's probably just come back from the war. He's got this and this and this, and then suddenly, like about halfway through his argument, and he's going, he's like, right, there is someone who fits this entire description, fits this profile, and it's Watson. And then he immediately goes, oh, okay, it must just be the shock talking, and so it's that weird kind of. I think I just don't like it because of the awkwardness to the scene rather than anything else.
They needed that in there though, because I don't know if you remember this bit, but the bit afterwards, he finds a present on the mantelpiece from Irene. Do you remember that bit with the phone in?
That was the phone, wasn't it?
And before he, because obviously the point in with that is that the main part of that speech to Molly is you have wrapped this parcel in the same colour wrapping paper as your lipstick, whether that's to subconsciously make that link between, you know, you and, you know, your beauty, or, you know, whether you've done it on purpose. And then he finds a parcel on the mantelpiece, and just before he gets that parcel on the mantelpiece, you get an image, a very, very quick image of Irene applying her lipstick. And then it's the same. Did you not? Oh, and it's
I didn't catch
I only
that.
just noticed this today as well when I was rewatching it. And, again, and yeah, it's the same colour as her lipstick, and that is used there, in my opinion, to again as another clue to Sherlock that Irene actually has feelings for him, which is what leads to that final deduction where he can unlock the phone. So I love that scene. I think it's wonderful. I mean, it's so awkward and it's funny, but it's also necessary for the plot of the story and for Sherlock to help understand that Irene likes him.
So what do you think about that? Because that's a difference between the two. Is Irene Adler falls for Holmes, Irena Adler doesn't, and marries, I can't remember his name, but marries a lawyer, and then they oh, all right, yes. So what do you think about that? What do you think about that as a difference between them?
I like that Irene likes her back, but a lot of people, I have seen this criticism a lot, is a lot of people describe the part I am Sherlocked in her phone in the BBC version as the equivalent of drawing love hearts all over your exercise book, and they really sort of diminish it, and I think that's really unfair. um, but at the same time, I can understand where they're coming from, because it leads to, and this happens as well in the Robert Downey Jr. version. Her feelings for Holmes actually leads to her downfall. So this is a spoiler, but in the Robert Downey Jr. version, I've told you this spoiler, so you
Yeah, so I don't
now
know.
know. You already know.
I already know. You already told me.
So Irene Adler is killed by Moriarty because of her feelings for Holmes, so she's no longer reliable. And in the same way, in this BBC version, Irene Adler loses to Sherlock Holmes because she has feelings for him, and Sherlock discovers that and then uses that to unlock her phone, which is a little bit, and this, and I was saying this earlier too, this is quite a frequent thing that seems to happen in the BBC Sherlock, like a woman's feelings for a man um, tends to, and I won't spoil this for you because you've not seen it yet, but it does tend to lead to their downfall in some way. So the way they represent it almost is that it makes her weaker. I disagree with that. I think it adds a really good dynamic to their relationships, because they're both always trying to outsmart people. They're always trying to be rational, intellectual, be one step ahead of each other, and then they've got these feelings for them that holds them back, which makes the dynamic of their relationship very interesting. And it's not just her, because I think Sherlock does have some feelings for her. Whether they're romantic or not is not really clear within the BBC version, in my opinion. But then obviously that leads to her sentiment, which he says is something found in the losing side, then leads to his down, leads to is something that he later shows when he goes to rescue Irene. But it doesn't seem to be considered such a bad thing for him. It's like, as a, people perceive it as another really extra dynamic and making him more human, whereas with the women it tends to lead to their downfall, which
yeah, I was thinking that with
poor gender representation, really.
Because I was thinking that about the Brett version is, so it's fairly, as I mentioned, it's fairly clear that Irena Adler doesn't have feelings for Holmes because she gets married, but it's very clear. I would say it's very clear that he does have feelings for her.
Yes, and we were saying this is because whenever he looks at Irene Adler in trying to get his plan done, there's that romantic music that plays, and there's the softening of the features. So it's very obvious in the Jeremy Brett version that he does have feelings for her.
Well, I mean, we were also talking about it that I didn't actually, I've not spotted this. I've watched it a couple of times. I've not spotted that. But one thing I do like is he's talking about his day kind of following her and to the wedding. And he says that he's not, it's like he said, he's dressed as this groom. He's really kind of scruffy. He's got this kind of prosthetic on. So he looks dirty and ugly. And he hops in the cab. And I think he says when he's talking to Watson, like, the cab driver gave me a second look, but when I gave him a handful of sovereigns, he didn't look, and we just drove. So he's talking about a handful of sovereigns. Holmes is a fairly wealthy man, even by Victorian standards, he's fairly wealthy with all he's doing. And then he's a witness, because they need a witness to witness the wedding, otherwise it's not legal. So he's there. They rope him into it. He witnesses the wedding, probably signs whatever, and goes back out. And Irena Adler gives him a sovereign. So he's just handed out a handful to this cab driver, and he pulls it out of his pocket when he's talking to Watson. He's like, she gave me a sovereign. And I think he then comments that he's going to put it on one of his his Albert chain, and he puts it on to show. And it's that kind of, it's very clear that Holmes does have feelings for her, especially with it at the end when, even though he fails to get the picture, the King of Bohemia says, "You know what? You can, like, I'll give you anything." And he pulls off a ring that's probably worth kind of a fortune. So I'll give you this ring. It's like, there is something else that I'd rather have. And he picks up the picture because Edina Adler had left a different picture, a different photograph, not the one with her and the king, as a kind of little prize, little consolation prize. And Holmes asks for that one rather than any monetary reward. So it was one of those things that's very different. And even though he loses, Holmes does, he doesn't lose, kind of going to what you were saying, he doesn't lose because of his feelings for her.
No.
He loses just because she realizes, Sherlock Holmes was this old vicar. He now knows where the photograph is. I'm gonna leave now. So she wins because of her brains, not because of his heart, his feelings. So I think,
yes,
it does go to that.
It was, to me, like we were saying, it was very obvious in the Brett version that he liked her. I find it less obvious in the actual book. And I think I was saying this to you earlier. It's because Watson's writing it, and Watson does not like to see Sherlock in that way. He likes to see him as this, I believe the quote is, most perfect reasoning and observing machine. And then he describes any feeling that Sherlock would have as a grit in a sensitive instrument or a crack in one of his own high power lenses. So, obviously the grit and the crack, that implies, an imperfection. So, the fact that it's on, I feel like in the book, Watson almost ignores these feelings that he has for Irene, which I feel are obvious because he asks for her picture, which he wouldn't do normally. And the sovereign bit, I think, is in the book as well. Is that right?
Can't remember.
I feel like it is.
I need to reread this already.
So, like, these are all tokens of sentimentality that you might keep.
Yes.
But Watson doesn't want to see that, which is why he's so adamant that it wasn't because he felt anything romantic towards her. He just admired her intellect, But because Watson's writing it, it leaves the question of whether Sherlock actually likes Irene very up in the air, which is why I think Irene has been in like pretty much every single Sherlock Holmes version, because it's just such this big question that people like to explore, because there was never an obvious answer, because Watson's such an unreliable narrator.
Well, I think it's quite interesting to think about that, because also because the other character that's had probably as big an impact just in other things would be Moriarty.
Yes.
He only appears in one actual story.
Which I didn't know.
Which is really surprising for, like, he's such a big kind of central character of the mythos. There's so many little kind of theories. One theory that I think is, I don't want to say I like, because it might seem I agree with it. I don't agree with it, but I find it interesting, which is, if you read, is two things about Moriarty. One, the only person who actually meets him in the book that we know of is Holmes. Watson doesn't actually meet Moriarty.
Mm-hmm.
And two, the description we are given for Moriarty is very, very similar to the description for Holmes. So one of the ideas is that Moriarty is actually Holmes.
Oh yeah, I've heard that idea before.
Which to me sounds a bit weird, but I can kind of see where it's coming from.
I love that idea, yeah. And they certainly play on that similarity you've not seen enough of the BBC version yet, but they do play on that similarity in the BBC version a lot. Moriarty's saying, "Oh, me and you were the same," and so on. So because they both get bored easily, they're both highly intelligent, they both that sort of the crime sort of makes their life more interesting, because Sherlock likes to solve them and Moriarty likes to cause lots of problems. So yeah.
I think that was one thing I didn't like in the opening bit they showed from the end of the one before, which name I can't remember what that one's called.
The Great Game, I think.
Possibly.
The one when Moriarty's in the swimming pool.
Yes. So they showed the clips of that. And to me, it felt very much like they had, instead of having this very kind of business-like attitude of Moriarty, which is in the book, the final problem, because they only meet the once, or they meet twice. Once as a kind of like, if you take down my kind of criminal enterprise, I'm going to have to deal with you. I'm going to have to stop you doing it. And then the second time at the Reichenbach Falls, it's very business-like. It's like, I have this business, this criminal business, and you are stopping it working. And very like, I don't want to interact with you. I don't want to have to do anything, but I can't let this continue. This version felt a lot more like the Joker and Batman, which is something I've talked about before with you. It felt a little bit more like they had decided to write a different character, but call him Moriarty, and like someone who's very public. Whereas in the book, Holmes actually says, like, Watson is surprised because Professor Moriarty is this very well-respected professor. And Holmes says, well, he does everything kind of behind closed doors, and he hides everything, keeps things secret, and he doesn't want to bring attention to it. Whereas this person, he seemed to be a lot more kind of the idea of bringing things attention. Like the plane plot was connected to Moriarty, and he calls up Mycroft, or he texts him about the plot. It was like, I can't remember exactly what it is, but he's talking about the plane, like he's figured it out. And it just felt a little kind of like he was a different character, like he was more kind of the Joker or the Riddler from Batman.
Yeah, because his motives in the BBC series, it suggested that he's just found someone who's equal to him in intelligence, and he likes to give mysteries for him, like create really elaborate mysteries for him that he thinks he'll enjoy. It's like he likes to, it's almost like he likes to do it for fun. So it's not really because it's less about him getting in the way of his criminal organization, and more a personal relationship almost, in that they're very intellectually matched, and Moriarty enjoys creating these elaborate crimes that only Sherlock will be able to solve. And he likes to watch him dance, I believe, is one of the quotes. Or watch him, I think it's watch him dance is one of the quotes. So there's more of I like that dynamic. I think that's a really cool dynamic for a relationship, though. I personally find that more interesting than, well, he's getting in the way of my criminal organization. I find that a bit dull.
I think it might just be a case back to what I mentioned before of because they've called him Moriarty. I want him to be like the original Moriarty as written by Arthur Conan Doyle, rather than this character who is very much a different take on it. But I don't think it's necessarily just a modernization. I remember rather enjoying Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd century, which is kind of a very silly cartoon set 100 years in the future, but still kind of having the characters the same, the characters similar, and the plots being similar. Whereas they seem to have changed a lot more in this. Certainly with this one, though not Study in Pink. So I wonder if it's the length. I wonder if, randomly throwing anything out, I wonder if it would have almost been better to have had a 1 hour program, and then for the longer stories you just use 2 of them. You make it a 2-parter for the longer ones.
I just love that there's lots of character and relationships exploration in them. It gives lots and lots of time to do all of that, which is why I think the show's so rich. So actually, if you just focused on the mysteries, it's no different than what it was for all the other 50, however many versions there's been of Sherlock Holmes,
But I think the reason I say that is I think the Jeremy Brett version, I think, is only 45 minutes to a show. So that then would then give you, if you do it for an hour, that then gives you another 15 minutes for character moments as well. So
there were more character moments, I think, in the Jeremy Brett version, especially when it comes to the relationship between Irene Adler and the King, for example, because you actually saw moments from their relationship. Quite a close one. They really enjoyed themselves together. You actually see her dressed as a man going to a gentleman's bar at one point as well. And that's quite a dynamic to the relationship as well. The fact that he's happy for her to do that, and adds a bit of mischief to the relationship and stuff. So it makes it look more it makes it look like it was more heartbreaking for Irene, or Irena in this case, Irena in this case, to be turned down for that marriage because of her status, than is obvious in the book. It makes that more heartbreaking to watch for her. You kind of feel for her more, I think.
I think that kind of raises two things. One thing is a scene I really like at the end, where the king is kind of upset that he couldn't marry her. It's like, what a queen she would have been if only she were on my level. And then Holmes just replies with, the lady, like she most certainly is on a different level to His Highness.
Yes.
Which I just love. As this is like little barb that the king can't really take as an insult, because he by his words he's agreeing with him, kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, you see, I love the way they've changed Holmes over, because I can see elements of the BBC Holmes, who was really my sort of original Holmes, to the original Holmes and the Holmes in Brett, because there's moments where he shows impatience when people are rambling on about backstories and stuff that aren't really relevant to what's going on, to the crime, where he's like just closing his eyes, waiting for it all to be over. There's elements, like you were saying at the beginning, where he won't bow to the king, or he won't shake hands to the king. He doesn't observe those social proprieties either. But that's just with them a lot more. And then obviously the dry sense of humor as well. Like, well, he's on a different level. He's certainly on a different level to you. And so on, the dry sense of humor. Whereas in the BBC version, that's just like really obvious. He's just, he's obviously rude to people. When he's not interested in what people are saying, he's like, oh God, hurry up, get to the interesting things, and so on. So it's like these subtle elements that they've just kind of exploded in the new new Sherlock's character. So I like how that's expanded as well. And I think it's because people are just more visual these days. So they like to, whereas, sitting down these days, like how they do it in the Jeremy Brett version, basically sitting down and telling a story with a few flashbacks, that possibly wouldn't work for a modern audience so much. They like scenes, lots of big characters. So maybe that's why they've made it like that. I don't know.
I think that's getting into another question of, is that the way society has gone, so media's following, or has media decided, oh, okay, we're going to have loads of big scenes, loads of action, loads of this, and so society's attention span therefore is kind of decreased? Like, which one came first?
That's a big question.
We probably don't have time to cover it in this.
I don't know. I have got a very strong opinion on that, but I won't. It's kind of irrelevant. Yeah. Things that we're very used to short clips. Like a lot of people, when I was working with the kids in school, they tend to watch YouTube rather than TV. And YouTube clips are obviously a lot shorter. There's a lot more going on in a short amount of time. So maybe media is reflecting that by having faster paced plots and stuff, maybe. Possibly. I don't know. Or maybe it's the other way around. I don't know the answer to that question. It's a big question.
Chicken or egg? The ultimate question.
Yes.
All the various things. The other thing I was thinking of, in the Jeremy Brett version, he gets annoyed with the king, because the king, he comes in admittedly still a better disguise than Benedict Cumberbatch wearing a dog collar, but the king's got like this tiny strip of cloth, and like, oh, I am the Count von Krumm, you like don't that, which is not my real name. And Holmes is like, I know, tell me who you are, or I'm not going to do this, because I need to know all the facts. And I think Mycroft not following that in the Cumberbatch version is actually part of the undoing of the whole thing. Because if he'd been, just thinking about this, because the big problem for him was the plane being him being rumbled with his plane plot by Holmes, who accidentally kind of showing off got it to Adler, who then passed it on to Moriarty. And if Mycroft had started from the beginning with, there's a really important email for British security that's been lost, we've got to get it back before they break the code. If he'd started with that rather than one of the royal families got a picture that's a bit, oh, we don't want that getting out, which is how it's presented, because that's how the original was. If they'd kind of if he'd come clean on that, Holmes probably would have been more careful with the email and decoding it. I think. I mean,
yeah, you're probably right.
I mean, I'm speculating about what would have happened in a fictional story if someone had acted slightly differently. So, but then you lose that tension of
like Star Wars: The Last Jedi all over again.
But I mean, having said what I'm just trying to think what you could have done. What they could have done with that is they could have had we're going to give this, and then Holmes does decode the email, and then the tension is, has he kind of fallen for Irene and actually decoded it, or has he deliberately decoded it incorrectly to try and trip her up and whoever she's going to pass it on to or sell it on to. So I think there's still room for tension there, but
that would have been interesting.
It just seemed a bit odd for Mycroft, who knows Sherlock and probably knows that Sherlock likes to have all the facts, to deliberately obfuscate that probably rather key fact.
I'm not sure that's what I think. Mycroft didn't know that is what was on Irene's phone, because he knew that there was something on Irene's phone, and it wasn't just the pictures. There was loads of sort of state information on there, but he didn't know what precisely. So he probably wouldn't have bothered to tell Sherlock that because he didn't think it was relevant. Maybe. Just trying to explain his motives here.
Yeah, we're trying to read the mind of a fictional character.
They have nothing better to do at this present moment in time.
Yeah, it's the joy of lockdown. We are all Mycroft Holmes from the Greek Interpreter, just yes. Not really exercising. We're just staying in one room. So yeah, so I think I can't think if there's any other Scandal in Bohemia versions out there. There probably is some. I think there's one radio, but I think Jeremy Brett, their version is the most complete of any dramatized series. They didn't quite finish before his death. And they did do a few that they merged, like they merged the Mazarin Stone and the Three Garadebs, which is probably a good idea considering the plot of the Mazarin Stone. It's just, let's have criminals talk in 221B Baker Street, and then Holmes overhears them, basically.
I think he had writer's block when he was writing that one, maybe.
Quite possibly. And I think they merged another couple into, I can't remember, the Noble Bachelor. I think they combined two. I can't remember which ones they were. But they got quite a few there. Actually, thinking about it, the Three Garadebs is also one where Holmes shows emotion. It's one of the rare times, apparently, because in it, someone fires at them and wounds Watson, and then Holmes just yells out like, "Are you all right?" kind of thing. He's like really kind of worried for Watson, which kind of they are very close.
They are.
Depending on even if you don't subscribe
I meant, well, a lot of people interpret it as friendship. A lot of people interpret it as something else. You just don't know.
Well, that's the thing. I was going to say, even if you don't subscribe to the John Locke theory or the John Locke ship, then you still have to recognise that they're very close friends, if nothing else.
That's another interesting thing about very interesting thing about the John Watson in this new version, in this BBC version, because, and I feel like it's very obvious in this version, a lot of people were annoyed with this BBC Sherlock towards the end because they thought that they were setting up John and Sherlock to be together romantically, but then they didn't deliver. And it's quite, I think that's another interesting aspect of John's character, because you're not quite sure of his feelings towards Holmes, and Irene Adler seems to pick up on this in the BBC version, because there's that scene where her and John Watson are talking, and John's doing his "I'm not actually gay" thing that he does a lot in the BBC version, and then Irene Adler goes, "Well, I am, and look at us both." And then Sherlock comes in after that, so we don't see the ending of that conversation, but John's face is looking he kind of scoffs like it's ridiculous, but at the same time he looks kind of anxious when he hears that Sherlock had overheard other interesting aspect I feel of this, and that's not the only time that Irene Adler actually compares her feelings for Sherlock, which are very obvious in this BBC, and parallels them with John Watson's, what she feels are his feelings towards Sherlock, because there's this other bit where and this is the bit where they first meet Irene, and Irene
oh yeah. When Holmes is kind of injured, and she's just like, the person who hit you must really like you, because they've avoided that, all the kind of good parts of your face, or something like
exactly.
that.
And then she could just be winding him up. But what's most interesting about that bit, I feel, is after that, after John laughs dryly at that, like the most unamused laugh ever, he says, could you put some clothes on, please? And then Irene goes, why are you feeling exposed? Like, have I just revealed what you're feeling? You can interpret it this way. What have you feelings towards Sherlock that you were trying to hide, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of, this is why I find it difficult. This is one of the reasons why I find it difficult, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why I find it difficult to decide whether Sherlock had romantic feelings for Irene in the BBC version. Because there's just bits where it feels like they're kind of, I don't know if they're doing it as a joke or whatever, they're kind of putting John and Sherlock together almost. And I'm not the only one who thinks that. A couple of other people have said that as well. So,
well, it's not just Irene in this version. It's what was her job? Was she the teacher who he brings to the little kind of what's almost Christmas party type thing? Because she comments like, "Oh no, you're taken." Like, no, I don't have a girlfriend. It's like, "Oh no, you don't have a girlfriend. You've got Sherlock."
Yeah.
She basically says
she says, you said my friends are so wrong about you. You're a really good boyfriend. And then John's like, oh, thanks. And then he's like, yeah. And Sherlock Holmes is a very lucky man,
or something like that.
But, yeah, like that. Yeah.
So so she's not the only one who mentions it. I think if it had just been Irene, I think I'd be tempted to just kind of go with what you said earlier. It's like she can kind of I don't want to say read people, but she kind of knows ways of kind of messing with them. And I think it's obvious that Watson is not 100% comfortable with that. So is it just Irene trying to push buttons?
Yeah, he could just be trying to push buttons. It could be.
I don't know. I need to watch more before I make a decision on things. On my view.
But I think if she was, Irene's very good at deciding what people's motives are and understanding what's going on underneath everything. That's why she's able to get so far. A lot of people criticised Irene's character in the BBC version, saying that she just uses her sexuality to get where she wants to, but it's a lot more. It's not that. I mean, it probably is in some cases, but it's not just that. She knows how to push people's buttons, and she knows how people are really feeling, and then she can use that to manipulate them. But you could also argue for that, if you wanted to, that if John didn't have any feelings towards Sherlock, he wouldn't be bothered. He'd just laugh the whole thing off. So the fact that he feels uncomfortable about it suggests that maybe there's something else there. Because basically what she's saying in that scene, when she's saying, well, I'm gay and look at us both, she's saying, okay, so yeah, you're not gay, but you are mostly heterosexual, but you do have feelings for Sherlock. So it's like suggesting some sort of sexual fluidity there from John.
Well, I think we were talking. Well, I think I said this after we'd watched it. Is if memory serves, in medieval times, they viewed sexuality as kind of being almost a spectrum, where a woman would, in general, like an individual woman, not women in general, but a woman in general would find men attractive, but would find some women attractive, and same for a man. And it's so you get that kind of fluid kind of, yes, this is my, I don't want to say main sexuality, but it's normal for that person. But actually there's times where they kind of come off it and they go and they kind of are attracted to the other gender.
Yeah.
other people that they wouldn't normally be attracted to.
And we were saying it's actually far more progressive than modern views of sexuality as well, because
rather than
it's more of a spectrum rather than one or other.
Rather than this or that.
It's another dynamic about the BBC Sherlock there. Between, there's a lot of things going on there. I think it's quite a difficult one to analyse because there's just so much going on and it's just so well written. So you have to look at it in detail, I think, to understand it fully.
I think it probably would have. I think it'd probably be a good thing to do is to, if you are gonna like think about this, we probably should have actually just watched all the ones up to this as well.
Yes.
Probably should have done that, because that would have also given a wider idea as to kind of the John Locke question and kind of up to this point, and kind of getting more of a time with the characters, because unlike the Jeremy Brett version, the Jeremy version is very close to the books. So if you know the characters from the books and those stories, you're going to have an idea of these characters because they're basically the same. Whereas the ones here with the BBC, they are different. They're not. It's not huge differences in most cases.
And I feel like they never, because it was so near but so different, as you were saying, I feel like perhaps the writers never fully made up their mind about what direction they wanted to put all these characters in, which is why the season 4 ended up being a bit of a mess, because they'd made it so similar but so different, and now they were trying to decide what on earth they wanted to do with this, with these characters, because one side they wanted to please the traditionalists who really like the traditional Sherlock, and on the other side they wanted to sort of please the people who are liking this new BBC Sherlock and have made up their own minds about things and so on. So I think that's probably why you've not seen season 4 yet. Oh, it's a mess.
I've not. Well, I think to be fair, I think this is a problem that a lot of TV shows have.
Yeah.
Is they have an idea of, this is where I'm going to go for like series 1, and then if they've not planned for further ahead, they end up going like, oh, what are we doing for series 2? Okay, well, we're going to take ideas. The Simpsons, for most people, even I think in series 3, we're looking back at old videos to go, what kind of hints can we do to kind of give us another idea? A series I've been watching quite a bit of is the Babylon 5 series, and one of the things that happens there is the writer Joe Michael Straczynski was told the 5th season was cancelled, so then he squashes all of the 5th season into the 4th series, because he had 5 series worth of material written, crams that in, and then gets told, actually, after that was filmed, we're going to give you a 5th season after all of that had been written. So now he's got to come up with a 5th series worth of material, and it's a bit all over. Certainly the beginning of that series is all over the place.
I think a lot of the problem is, and this was, if we think back to our Rise of Skywalker podcast, I think a lot of the problem these days is that, there's people are expressing all their opinions on social media, on things like Tumblr and Reddit, and there's just so many different people are able to discuss these different opinions, and then there becomes movement. So in the case of Sherlock, sort of the traditionalist Sherlocks, you might have people who want Moriarty to come back, lots of people with lots of different theories, and I think it can actually confuse the writers because they end up trying to please as many people as possible.
I think that is a problem. Yeah, is listening to social media happens a lot, especially if you're a big person in social media. Like I think Mark Gatiss is. I think he's probably quite big in social media. So that means if you do that, you end up in a position where, if you are listening to all these people, social media is for one thing and also against it, because you'll have a large group of people on each side, both of them very, very loud.
Yes.
And I think what can then happen as a writer is, if you then go off to follow one or the other, is that pulls you away from what you were originally planning. And out of people on social media, including us, people on social media, including us, or a professional writer, I think we have to realise that the person who's going to be the best at writing He's going to be the professional writer.
Yes, you're right. Well,
So
hopefully.
Hopefully. So what would be ideal is if they managed to have that kind of confidence in their writing and what they were doing, so that they could, so that they would just stick to their path and what they've planned. But I think often what happens is sometimes even on social media there'll be a good idea and it'll be, oh, we're going to include that, but that still pulls you off, and it's like, okay, well, we were planning on going off to the left and now we're getting pulled to the right, or whichever way you describe it.
We
and
were
now
building all the characters to get into this situation, you know.
But now we've seen this good idea and we want to now jump this way, and now
yeah. It's very different, I think, TV writing and story writing than what it used to be. So now that social media is involved.
Yes.
Have we discussed everything?
I think I've got through all my notes.
I haven't got through all mine, but we won't.
Well, we weren't going to in this time.
We won't go into it. I wrote a lot.
So there you go. I think I am actually, to be fair, I am looking forward to watching some more of these actually, and giving them.
I'm looking forward to hearing your opinions on them.
Even though they're all wrong.
No, I don't think your opinions are wrong. They're just different to mine. That's okay.
Yeah, I know. So yeah, I don't know what we're going to do next for a podcast. I think we'll probably discuss that and then do it when we come up with an idea. It's probably best not to actually say in a podcast what we're going to do for the next one, because we'll probably end up doing something different, knowing us. Yeah, so yeah, I think it's been interesting. I think it'd be good to do another one. I'm sure there's other ones that they've both done that we can have a look at. But there we go. So that's our podcast on Sherlock Holmes, the scandal in Bohemia / Belgravia. I hope you've enjoyed. So thanks for joining.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.